It was the longest war in U.S. history, spanning an era that saw the Alamo, the Mexican-American War, and the Civil War come and go. It was the 60 years of ongoing battles, fights, and raids that took place between the Great Plains nomadic horse warriors and settlers, traders, and the United States military. With as many as 20,000 casualties on each side, it made the wild, wild West a dangerous and violent place. It is simply called the Indian Wars. The year was 1837. Martin Van Buren was in the White House. The famous Santa Fe Trail busily carried traders to New Mexico, and the fledgling Oregon Trail transported a few settlers and missionaries to Oregon country. Native American tribes from the east had been forced west into the newly designated Indian Territory, a territory already occupied by a flourishing Plains Indian culture. And Stephen Watts Kearny, the father of the U.S. Cavalry, wrote his Manual for the Exercise and Maneuvering of United States Dragoons. The Dragoons were the forerunner of America's celebrated frontier cavalry, soldiers on horseback. Organized in 1833, the Dragoons were the elite troopers of the frontier army. Their job was to police the western plains. Their weapons were the Prussian-style saber, known as Old Wristbreaker, the muzzle-loading .52 caliber rifle, and a .54 caliber pistol, both of which could blow a hole in a man the size of a melon. They also possessed formidable mountain howitzers. They dressed in flashy, striking uniforms of dark blue, with yellow piping, much like those the cavalry would later wear. In 1851, the official uniform was changed to blue with orange trim, no doubt meant to impress the colorfully painted Indian warriors of the plains. On the frontier, there were no buildings or structures to house these troops, so a series of forts was built, roughly paralleling the 95th meridian from Minnesota to Texas, a boundary separating Indian territory from white settlements. Typical of these military posts was Fort Scott. In 1842, Companies A and C of the 1st and 2nd Dragoons were sent to what would become eastern Kansas. Assisted by only a handful of artisans and using local resources, their first task was to build the fort they were to occupy. The men completed the post in 1846 for a mere $32,000. Like most large military posts on the western frontier, Fort Scott was not enclosed by walls and resembled a village more than a traditional fort. A large parade ground formed the fort's nucleus, and at its center flew the American flag. The parade grounds were ringed by a complement of buildings: officers' quarters, barracks to house the cavalry and infantry, stables for the horses, and an assortment of specialty buildings: guardhouse, blacksmith shop, weapons and munition storage, bakery, and the quartermaster or supply house. A dragoon regiment was divided into 10 companies of about 75 officers and men in each unit. A captain, first lieutenant, second lieutenant, 4 sergeants, 4 corporals, 2 buglers, 50 privates, a blacksmith, and a farrier who treated the horses. During the construction of Fort Scott, the new Indian Territory was relatively quiet, free of major conflict between the native tribes and whites. However, in May of 1834, one of the dragoons' first major duties was to escort a wagon train along the Santa Fe Trail to Mexican territory. Colonel Henry Dodge took 8 companies of the 1st Dragoons into Indian Territory. In June, he recovered a white captive and conducted the first major conference with the heretofore nearly unknown Comanche and Kiowa tribes. Born in 1794, Kearny began his military career as a lieutenant in the War of 1812. A strong proponent of manifest destiny, he led the nation's move westward as an explorer and soldier. By the spring of 1845, he was ready to provide an impressive display of dragoon power to the Plains tribes. Kearny gathered 5 companies of dragoons, including a company from Fort Scott, and crossed the Great Plains. In May, Kearny marched his dragoons from Fort Leavenworth in eastern Kansas, northwest to the Platte River, and then proceeded west to Fort Laramie. Along the way, he showed the flag to the native tribes. At a parley with the Pawnee, he requested they make peace with their traditional enemies, the Sioux. When they refused, the dragoons fired their mountain howitzers, so impressing the Pawnee that the tribe remained peaceful for the next 4 years. It was the Sioux's turn next. At Fort Laramie, the dragoons once more impressed the Indians with their firepower. The Sioux believed the dragoons were a new and superior kind of white people, and they agreed to leave the immigrant traffic alone if the immigrants behaved themselves. From Fort Laramie, Kearny and his men traveled the Oregon Trail as far west as present-day Wyoming's South Pass. It was the first time the U.S. military had crossed the Continental Divide. He then marched his troops south to Bent's Fort, where he parleyed with the Southern Cheyenne, a famous trading post in southeastern Colorado. Bent's Fort was founded in 1833 on the Arkansas River by William and Charles Bent and their partner Soran Saint-Vrain. During its initial 16-year history, it was the single major white trading post on the Santa Fe Trail between Missouri and the Mexican settlements in present-day New Mexico. Colonel Kearny's trip to Bent's Fort in 1845 and again in 1846 so impressed Cheyenne chiefs with the power of the United States military that they feared for the future of their people. The Bent family and the second Bent Fort, built 30 miles downstream in 1853, eventually played prominent roles in the Indian Wars that would soon follow. From Bent's Fort, Kearny returned to Kansas along the Santa Fe Trail. His long 2,200-mile march in 99 days through the vast, semi-arid prairie proved that U.S. mounted troops could move rapidly and easily on the plains. Indeed, A year after Kearny's long march, he took his beloved dragoons into the Mexican-American War, winning New Mexico and California for the U.S. Kearny briefly served as military governor of both territories. Then sadly, in 1848, he died from a bout of yellow fever contracted during the war. A year later, gold would be discovered in California, signaling the beginning of the Indian Wars. As for the Dragoon Regiment, in 1861, the Dragoon designations disappeared. The 1st and 2nd Dragoons became the 1st and 2nd Cavalry, and the Mounted Rifles became the 3rd Cavalry. All the units adopted the blue uniform with yellow trim, and the units became cavalry with yellow as their colors. Although the Dragoons resisted the new designation and the change to their uniforms, as the old uniforms wore out, they finally accepted their new role as cavalry. The Mexican-American War was a turning point for the U.S. military. For the first time since George Washington's winter at Valley Forge, the United States government created a large-scale professional army. After the Mexican-American War, America was a continental nation extending from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And the land along the Pacific coast is where Americans wanted to go. To the gold fields near San Francisco and the fertile farming valleys in Oregon. In a massive push to the Pacific coast, miners and settlers would have to traverse Indian country along the many overland trails. 50,000 immigrants traveled the Oregon Trail in 1850 alone. With over 200,000 Indians on the plains, Washington believed it had a duty to protect its traveling citizens. As a result, Congress authorized the War Department to construct a string of forts and outposts along the overland trails. By 1854, it had built over 50 garrisons. However, typical of Washington's approach to the Indian Wars, it sorely undermanned them with a mere 7,800 soldiers. The jewel of the northern system of forts was not built, but acquired. It was Fort Laramie in eastern Wyoming. Fort Laramie had started out as a trading post for trappers and Indians. In 1849, the Army's Adjutant General, Roger Jones, directed that a post be established at or near Fort Laramie. Rather than build a new fort, the Army purchased the trading post from Bruce Husband, agent of the American Fur Company, for $4,000. Immediately, the Army began refitting the old trading post as an Army post. By winter, officers' and soldiers' quarters, a bakery, and stables had been completed, and Fort Laramie began its 40-year role as a command post deep in the heart of Indian Territory. Fort Laramie quickly became the most famous, and some even say the most infamous post on the western frontier. For the over 350,000 travelers on the Oregon and Mormon trails, it was the lone beacon of civilization between East and West. Since its founding as a trading post in 1834, the list of those who entered the storied fort read like a who's who of the Old West. famous trappers and mountain men, James Beckwourth, Thomas Fitzpatrick, Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, and the ill-fated Donner Party, whose members would later eat each other, passed through in 1846. Brigham Young leading his Mormons to Utah. Top military commanders, William Tecumseh Sherman, Philip Sheridan, George Crook, and William Harney. Many of the famous chiefs of the Northern Plains spent time at the fort as well, along with a cast of colorful Western characters: Buffalo Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, Calamity Jane, and Wyatt Earp. Less famous, though perhaps more important, were the troopers who manned the fort on a daily basis. Over its active 40-year history, units from nearly every cavalry and infantry regiment that fought in the Indian Wars served at the fort. But in 1849, it was the mounted riflemen and infantry soldiers who rode out from Fort Laramie to maintain the Oregon Trail. Patrols also escorted travelers, providing protection against the oftentimes curious Native Americans who at this time had rarely, if ever, seen a white man. The mounted riflemen, like the dragoons, was a short-lived regiment, lasting a mere 15 years. They rode horses, dismounted, and then fought from the ground with their rifles. These unique riflemen served at Fort Laramie until the Civil War, when the regiment was redesignated the 3rd Cavalry. The simplest way for the men of these companies to do their mandated job of policing the trails in the 1850s was not through their weapons, but through the peace pipe, creating an agreement or a treaty that allowed the immigrants to pass peacefully through Indian territory. Peace treaties had been the primary tool for negotiating with native tribes since the Dutch acquired Manhattan in 1624. They were in effect giant parties where Indian chiefs and representatives of the U.S. government met to hammer out, in the short term, who would get what land and how the parties would behave towards each other. The key figure in what would be called the Laramie Treaty was legendary mountain man Thomas Fitzpatrick, known among the Indians as Broken Hand. The Plains tribes knew and trusted Fitzpatrick, and the old mountain man knew that if something weren't done, soon the Indians would rise up against the ever-growing number of travelers on the Oregon Trail. Consequently, in 1849, Fitzpatrick sent word to Washington, requesting that a peace conference be called at Fort Laramie. Early in 1851, Congress appropriated $100,000 for such a purpose. But would the tribes respond? Once the snows were off the plains in the spring of that year, Fitzpatrick sent out trappers, mountain men, and some fort Indians to invite all the Plains tribes to a peace conference. Everyone waited throughout the summer. Then in September, clouds of dust obscured the horizon. Fitzpatrick and the government representatives were awed by the arrival of more than 10,000 Indians from the northern plains, including such hereditary enemies as the Cheyenne and Shoshone, Sioux, and Crow. The Fort Laramie Council was the largest of its kind ever seen on the plains. Such a huge number of warriors was clearly a threat to the three companies, a mere 180 troops stationed at Fort Laramie. In a clever move, Fort Laramie's commander, Captain William Scott Ketchum of the 6th Infantry, suggested that the council be moved 30 miles downstream to a better grazing area for the thousands of horses. And so it took place at the confluence of Horse Creek and the Platte River, just east of the current Wyoming-Nebraska state line. For nearly 2 weeks, the various tribes put on amazing displays of warrior prowess on horseback. The Americans passed out gifts. Leaders on both sides stood to deliver great speeches. By the end of the proceedings, a pipe, a traditional sign of a peace ceremony, was smoked and the treaty was signed. It was a remarkable accomplishment, allowing the U.S. government to construct a series of forts along the Oregon Trail. The Indians would not attack the wagon trains, and the immigrants would not settle in Indian territory. The military was allowed to patrol the trails, providing some semblance of law and order, and both sides agreed to punish their own lawbreakers. For 3 years, peace among whites and Indians reigned on the northern plains. Then in August 1854, an impetuous young officer, Lieutenant John Grattan, took a patrol of 29 men from Fort Laramie to arrest a Sioux Indian named High Forehead, who had stolen and butchered a Mormon's cow. The Sioux would not turn over the guilty party to the soldiers, and after a brief parley, the soldiers unexpectedly opened fire on the camp, killing its chief. The Sioux camp retaliated, massacring every member of Grattan's patrol. In that moment, the Indian Wars unofficially began. For the next 35 years, Fort Laramie played a prominent role in the conflict between the U.S. military and the Indian tribes of the northern plains. It became a staging ground for strikes against Indian encampments and was the site of another peace conference in 1868. From 1860 to 1861, Pony Express couriers rode through the fort. During the Civil War, volunteer regiments replaced some of the professional soldiers. Finally, in 1890, the fort closed for good. While Fort Laramie dominated the northern plains in 1854, to the south other settlers and traders were traveling another famous road, the Santa Fe Trail, requiring the building of even more forts. While the northern tribes had fewer encounters with whites before the 1850s, the southern Indians, Kiowa, Comanche, Navajo, and Apache, had a long, violent history of conflict with Europeans. The Comanche, Apache, and Navajo had repeatedly defeated the Spanish, who were ill-prepared to rule the harsh southern plains. Later, they regularly raided Mexican and Texas settlements. Now that their lands had officially become part of the United States, the War Department was pressed to end the Indian threat to the Santa Fe Trail.
Yeah, Hispanics, Mexicans from Santa Fe going east, they're hauling furs, stuff like that, stuff that you can't get back in St. Louis. And you got St. Louis merchants going west. They're hauling the nice shirts, the blankets, bottles, even fancy stuff that you can't get in Santa Fe. They don't have no manufacturing there yet.
Once again, the Army employed the strategy of building forts and outposts to handle the increasing number of raids. One of the most prominent forts along the Santa Fe Trail, Fort Larned, was significant for the role it was to play as a post, a refuge, a supply point, and a distribution center for Indian annuities. Annuities, which were promised in peace treaties to the various tribes, were a kind of bribe to keep the peace. They typically consisted of flour, coffee, sugar, and trade goods, such as cloth, beads, and even arms and ammunition. Also supplied were agricultural implements, which were used to teach the Plains Indians farming and to discourage their nomadic lifestyle. However, the annuity plan created its own problems. All at once, hundreds of heavily armed Native American warriors descended on the post to collect their goods, sometimes dressed in their finest regalia, complete with painted faces and long war headdresses of eagle feathers. And the soldiers knew if the Indians went away unhappy, their anger might erupt into raids and even warfare. At times, the goods and food were of shoddy quality, or even worse, hadn't arrived at all. At these moments, tension ran high for the soldiers. In fact, in 1860, Fort Larned was known as Camp Alert because the danger of Indian attacks kept the soldiers on a knife edge. When word of a raid reached Fort Larned, the commander's response was to send out a patrol. A small patrol usually consisted of 10 to 20 privates and was led by a lieutenant and a sergeant. Each trooper was a self-contained unit.
The cavalry have been equipped essentially like this with a McClellan saddle. The bag here is called a nose bag. We have a little grain for maybe a day or two. We have a picket pin and a rope so we can stake him out at night. If that doesn't work, if the ground is too hard, we have chains and hobbles. Inside of the bag we have a shelter half. My partner has the other half of the shelter, a blanket, perhaps change of clothes. Saddlebags would contain some bacon, hardtack, maybe some sardines. If I didn't spend all of my money, I'd maybe buy a couple of cans of sardines. I have a poncho. The carbine is a Springfield Model 4570. We also carried a Colt, which was a Model 1873 Colt 45, the Army Colt. Horses were typically maybe a little bit larger than this, but not any smaller.
Enthusiastic troopers often carried personal weapons such as extra pistols and knives when on patrol. Because the Indians roamed freely across the vast prairie, the Army had difficulty finding raiding parties. They relied on mountain men and trappers, who were skilled trackers as scouts. These intrepid men had learned the Indians' habits and customs, and often knew the area as well as they did. Wearing uniforms marked by red stripes, infantry soldiers did not carry swords, but had bayonets. Their standard rifles, usually a .58 caliber muzzle-loading musket, were longer ranged than the cavalry's arms and laid down a better field of killing fire. Then in 1861, everything changed. The Civil War erupted, and the military, long neglected, took center stage. Everything military was overhauled. Training, weapons, leadership, and strategies all were vastly improved. At first, the Western garrison suffered. Volunteer units replaced most of Fort Larned's professional soldiers. But when Indian raids threatened critical supplies carried along the Santa Fe Trail, the Union sent 2 companies of cavalry to Fort Larned, and the trail once more became quiet until 1864, when a much-anticipated Indian uprising swept the prairie. Trade along the trail was paralyzed that summer and fall. As a result, larger, more punitive expeditions were sent out from Fort Larned and Fort Lyon. The U.S. military was about to begin a new phase of Indian fighting on the plains. Different tactics, as perfected by Kit Carson during the Army's campaign against the Navajo, would be used. It was also a time when forts, such as Larned, transitioned from havens for travelers to battle stations and supply centers for the new extended field campaigns. Born in 1809, Christopher Kit Carson, known as rope thrower to the Indians, became one of America's greatest frontier heroes in the mold of George Rogers Clark, Daniel Boone, and Davy Crockett. At the age of 16, he left home and started trapping, eventually becoming a legendary mountain man. His explorations led him the length of the Rocky Mountains into California. It was a time when few men survived the rugged travel through the mountains and deserts of the West. However, Carson had learned the ways of the Indians. By the time he was 40, his exploits were the tales told in salons of eastern cities. An unusual man along the rough and tumble community of mountain men, Carson, according to fellow trappers, was clean as a hound's tooth, and a man whose word was as sure as the sun coming up. He would soon become one of the pivotal commanders in the Indian Wars. The Navajo were a warrior culture that occupied the canyon lands of present-day New Mexico and Arizona. They had become a horse society before the famous nomadic tribes exploded onto the plains. After the Mexican-American War, the Navajo were in constant conflict with the United States military. In 1860, the Navajo chiefs Manuelito and Barboncito gathered 1,000 warriors and attacked Fort Defiance. The fighting was hand-to-hand, and the Navajo very nearly succeeded in capturing it. But when the dust settled, the army decided that it had to make an example of the Navajo in order to teach the desert Indians that they could not attack American soldiers. All-out war fell upon the tribe. For a year, U.S. Army Colonel Edward Canby chased after the elusive Navajo, but could not capture them. When the Civil War broke out a year later, the Navajo were temporarily forgotten. But in 1862, Union Brigadier General James Carleton led a force of men from California to fight Confederate troops. But by the time he arrived, the rebels were already retreating. Carleton turned his attention to the Navajo, determined to subdue them, completing what the Army couldn't do in the years before the Civil War. Carleton sought the help of Kit Carson, a longtime friend of the Navajo. Carson had been appointed a colonel in the 1st New Mexico Infantry in September 1861. Carson understood the Navajo. He had wintered with them, fought with them, and hunted with them. When Manuelito and others spurned his offers of peace, he knew the only way to victory was to destroy their farms and villages. No more peace treaties, no more retaliatory patrols. Instead, search them out and destroy them. So Carson, the one-time ally of the Navajo, began his scorched earth policy, destroying their fields, their crops, their livestock and orchards. Within only a few months, the Navajo, starving and dressed in rags, surrendered and were sent to Bosque Redondo Reservation on the Pecos River, far from their homeland. After the Civil War, the Fetterman Massacre in northern Wyoming would turn public opinion against the Native Americans on the plains. In 1866, a war party of Sioux, led by High Backbone, lured a cavalry patrol of 80 men out of Fort Phil Kearny. The patrol, commanded by Captain William J. Fetterman, was ambushed, and all his men, including himself, were killed. Scalping and mutilation followed. Shocked and outraged, Americans demanded something be done. From the United States government point of view, the Plains Indians could no longer be allowed to live their nomadic lifestyle. For the whites, one disturbing facet of the Indian Wars was the Indian tactic of random raiding and killing. Rather than attacking the whites who had actually injured them, they took out their anger by raiding any available homesteads, wagon trains, or military patrols. Innocent settlers and travelers were terrified by the threat of their families being tortured and mutilated. An approach was needed. The old military tactic of punishing the actual perpetrators of raids would never end the problem, since the guilty raiders could seldom be located. They needed to eliminate the threat at the source, find the Indian villages and destroy them, capture or kill their ponies, and exterminate their primary food sources. This was what Kit Carson had so successfully done with the Navajo in the mid-1860s. Two hardened Civil War veterans were put in charge of the operation, and further developed a total war strategy of eliminating the Indian problem once and for all. These two veterans were General Philip Sheridan and General William Tecumseh Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman was one of the most celebrated generals of the Civil War and a man of military vision. In 1864, he was the first to apply total war to the rebellious southern states as Carson had once done a year earlier. Born in Lancaster, Ohio in 1820, he graduated from West Point, 6th in his class. Like many Union generals, Sherman had participated in the Mexican-American War, then rose to his highest distinction fighting the Confederates. Born in Albany, New York in 1831, Sheridan also grew up in Ohio. He attended West Point and graduated near the bottom of his class in 1853. Sheridan rose from obscurity to lead the Union's cavalry by war's end. His campaign in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia smashed the South's most important agricultural region and helped to end the Civil War. Sherman brought his strategy of total war to the plains, and Sheridan refined it. Their shared philosophy of fighting Indians, summed up by Sherman, was simple. All Indians who are not on reservations are hostile and will remain so until killed off. Successfully implementing search and destroy required that the Army execute extensive campaigns with large military forces operating away from forts for weeks, even months. On July 1st, 1867, soldiers arrived here at Fort Davis, Texas. But they were not soldiers of the usual sort. They were black, and members of a new regiment, one of several whose men would soon become known as the Buffalo Soldiers. In 1866, the Army increased the number of cavalry regiments from 6 to 10, including 2 black units, the 9th and 10th. Called Buffalo Soldiers by the Indians because of the dark coats they wore and their short, curly hair, the black troopers epitomized America's new professional army, made up of battle-hardened veterans of the Civil War. Many of these men served on the western frontier until the Indian Wars ended in 1890. Fort Davis had been abandoned since 1861, and now companies C, F, H, and I of the 9th U.S. Cavalry under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Wesley Merritt returned. In addition to rebuilding the fort, the troopers escorted mail and stagecoaches, constructed roads, patrolled the Mexican border, and battled the Apache and Comanche. The 9th fought mostly in the Southwest until 1881. Later, units went to Kansas and Washington State. The 10th served with General Sheridan and were commanded by Colonel Benjamin Grierson, who had the 10th from 1866 to 1890 in the southern plains of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Disciplined and tough, the 9th and 10th fought in 127 confirmed battles with Indians, on average inflicting 4.6 casualties per skirmish. Units from both regiments served in the Spanish-American War, the Philippine Insurrection, and Pershing's 1916 punitive raid into Mexico. At the outset of World War II, the 9th and 10th Cavalry were disbanded, and their units absorbed into the Army. With the tragedy at Wounded Knee in 1890, the need for the cavalry on the plains vanished. The once important forts were abandoned. The era of the wild, wild West was over. What remained was a 40-year chapter in U.S. military history. It was a history that saw the cavalry grow from one semi-professional regiment of troopers, showing the flag to the Native Americans, to 10 regiments of highly disciplined soldiers. Their weapons changed even more dramatically from the slow-loading ball and powder muskets and pistols to breech-loading metal cartridge carbines and repeating pistols. Added to their arsenal were lightweight portable cannons and Gatling guns. The composition of the cavalry's officer corps changed as well. During the final 20 years, many of the officers won their spurs in the Civil War and then went on to fight Indians. What didn't change was that the core of the rank-and-file soldiers continued to be comprised of immigrants, mainly from Ireland and Germany, with the Irish making up more than 20% of recruits and Germans 12%. Many of these men had been soldiers in their homelands and quickly adapted to American Army life, often becoming non-commissioned officers. In the 40 years from 1850 to 1890, over 70,000 men fought in more than 1,450 battles, inflicting an estimated 15,000 casualties on the Indians. During the same time, the number of troopers and civilians killed and wounded was around 12,000. Incredibly, more than 100 posts had been built on the plains during the Indian Wars. Even though the Indian Wars are long over, the tales of battles and individual valor will be told again and again in books, on the silver screen, and on television. The cavalry would once again arrive in the nick of time to save the day. Outposts such as Laramie, Larned, Davis, brave men, Kearney, Crook, Carson. Bold and daring to the point of recklessness, fighters like Custer and Fetterman, and visionary militarists like Sheridan and Sherman will live on forever. No other group fulfilled the romantic vision of the United States military like the U.S. Cavalry.